Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the News Behind the News with Rafkin Tav on Mix 94.7 FM, and thank you for joining me on today's program. This afternoon, we're going to delve again into the world of arts, as I have here with me an award-winning artist, Ms. Deborah Jack. Good afternoon to you, and thanks for being on the program.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So it's glad to meet the artist in the flesh. I say that because, first time I came across your name was years ago, around 2013 or so, at the library, looking through, books about St. Martin, and I saw your book. I think it's Skin, the one with the red cover.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if it was that book or the other one that had a saying, or you had a quote, something along the lines of, if you think St. Martin's too small to make if you're too small to make a difference, I'll just drop a grain of salt in, grain of sand in your eye. How is that?
It's a poem called It's called "Walk Softly, Carry a Big Stick," and it's if 37 square miles of land feels like a grain of sand in your hand, drop it in your eye and come again.
Gotcha. That's it. I thought that was so beautiful and magnificent, and well said. When you think about St. Martin, because we often say, even sometimes when we introduce ourselves. I come from a small island, and I never forgot when one time I did that while at a conference a couple of years back, and the gentleman pulled me aside and said, "Don't ever say that again." Right. And he said because England is a small island as well, and they were able to conquer half the world.
Right, he's correct. I feel the same way. I said, I don't like to hear it either, because in a sense, people say it apologetically. Like, I'm from a small island, and I remember after, especially since I remember going to undergraduate and realizing that a lot of my classmates, and this was like in '89, hadn't even been on a plane before, had only ever heard English. Meanwhile, St. Martin, you had all these different languages. A lot of our people had traveled around the world, and here was somebody who was from Vermont, who had just never even seen the sea. After that, I was like, oh, okay, these people are not that much better than we are,
That's right. I remember when I went to school in Florida, and you had quite a bit of students who never left Florida, never left their county, except for having to go to school. So it says a lot about, that we shouldn't downcast our experience, our livelihood, our culture, and so forth.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I'm totally along the lines of that. I think, when I've come here and sat on cable, I remember years ago, one day just flipping through the channels, and there was German news, there was French news, there was Spanish, there was, and then CNN had like CNN World, and I remember thinking, this is completely, you're getting such a well-rounded flow of information that comes to a place like this, that we're not, a small landmass doesn't necessarily have to, represent a small way of thinking.
That's right. That's right. So, with that, can you tell us a bit about yourself? And, given that you have spent a majority of your professional career in media and arts, can you also share with us how has art shaped your being?
I think I grew up around art in the sense that my dad, Harold Jack, the late Harold Jack, was a musician. My mom sang. My brother was a musician. My dad also painted. He would, not in any big way, but he would. There was always this beautiful portrait that he had painted of my mom, half as a modern woman and half in sort of African garb, and it hung in their bedroom. So I think, subconsciously, for me, I think art was something that you just sort of lived with, or you did to express yourself. My brother used to draw like little murals of war scenes and jet planes and the ocean, and hung them in his room. And so, it was almost for me a matter of like figuring out what's my special artistic contribution to it. So I sort of tried them all. I'm from Kobe. I represent for Kobe all the time. I think that's another, a village that's a cauldron of creativity. and inventiveness
Definitely.
throughout my life. So I always represent for Kobe, and I think somebody needs to write a book about
Someone
Kobe one of these
is
days.
writing a book. This, I guess, a side note there. I forgot the name of the lady. There was a op-ed in the Daily Herald about the late Camille Bailey. I think Miss Pantoflet, I think, is a person.
Okay.
Yeah, Miss Pantoflet. I don't know, I can't remember her first name, but she stated that there were so many different people particularly from Kobe.
Yeah.
Or
who lived for an extended period in Kobe, because
and then
Mr.
she's
Bailey
working
lived
on a publication.
Oh, good.
So-
I mean, like, Camille Bailey, who was the head of culture, lived next to the Kobe Methodist Church. You had Kobe Theatre Company as an acting
Renaissance man,
group.
basically.
Right, yeah. And, you had Teklo Bell, even going back further than that, was a member of the Kobe Methodist Church who wrote plays and would put on pageants, and people would come from all the different churches to come and see them. So, yeah, I think, that too, just sort of growing up where creativity was a thing. My mom was part of Kobe Theatre Company, so I'd been exposed to theater at a very young age as well. So, while growing up here in St. Martin, even in my teen years, I did drama first, in the sense of, together with some friends, we started the teenage acting company that then worked with Ian Valls.
Oh, that's nice.
And created, at the time, we were told later that it was the first sort of like professional acting group made up of teens. We traveled and performed in different islands as well. And so, I think I'm always been a person who's leaned towards creative things. I wanted to make films when I was younger, and I think that was something that seemed really impossible. When I went to college and I tried to apply for a scholarship for film, that was not something that was an option in the 80s.
Yeah. It's kind of,
Still, it's rough. But it's possible, right?
Yes.
And the materials have changed.
Definitely,
And so now I think you have all the possibilities of making film that you didn't have before. But
yes.
So the closest I could come to it was doing communications, radio, TV, film production as a undergrad. With a whole bunch of minors, because I'm a curious person, and I think that curiosity is what led me then to sort of the kind of art I make now.
Gotcha. And you did a full 4-year term or more?
No, I did 4 years. I went to Milton Peters College. Shout out to Milton Peters.
Another Kobe.
I went to Milton Peters College. And then, I did my undergraduate degree in the U.S. And then I came back to St. Martin. I wanted to contribute, and so I worked in some after my studies, and so I worked for government for 6 or 7 years, and then went back and pursued my graduate degree. And my graduate degree was in fine art. At that time, I'd worked in St. Martin with Art Invasion, with people like Yume Dumoy. I started Axum Art Cafe with Muzera. At the time, it was Muzera, myself, Lydia Arnell, Yume Dumoy, and Yolanda Richardson. We were the ones who created Axum on Front Street.
That's history for me.
Because we wanted to have a site for what we saw as contemporary art and creativity.
Yeah.
Muzera and I had worked in his gallery on Front Street in the Spacious Arcade before, and that was one of the tenets of the space, that we were not going to show work that was like sort of the traditional landscape and portrait painting. We wanted to show contemporary and sort of more progressive work in the space that then grew into Axum.
Yeah.
And so after that, like having done all of those things, then I went back to do my graduate degree with the idea of trying to get an idea of what it took to go beyond St. Martin.
Understood.
And to be an artist, one that could survive on their art, or that would be able to get your art out to a larger audience. Being in St. Martin, it was really difficult. And at the time, you really had to depend sort of like on departments of culture. Whether it was St. Martin or the Netherlands Antilles.
Yeah.
And I remember the Netherlands Antilles had been invited to the São Paulo Biennial in Brazil, which was one of the biggest biennials in the region and one of the biggest in the world. And the Netherlands Antilles was invited, and they only took artists from Curacao and Aruba. And at the time, the prime minister, whose name just escapes me now, was upset and had, when he realized that, and had them come and do like a tour of all the islands to meet the artists and sort of apologize and also present what they did. And I remember Muzera and I were sitting in the back row of that, looking at the work and seeing that the kind of work was this sort of very contemporary look at Caribbean art and thinking about making art that was not your traditional like landscape and portrait painting, kind of like everything that we had been rooting for. And, you saw more abstraction and more conceptual types of work from all these other islands and in the region. And so for me, that was also a moment where it's like, okay, like if you have to keep depending on people in Curacao to make the decisions about who gets to be seen, we're never going to get seen.
That's right.
So, I decided to pursue an MFA, a Master's in Fine Art, and then figure out what exactly the strategies were for getting your work beyond.
Yeah, makes sense. And, even what you shared is really, it was a legit concern and struggle for St. Martin, to really be recognized and to express itself, as a nation, because we were always overshadowed by the three larger territories. In some instances, it was used as a crutch, but, I think the main thing is that it is worth, as a nation having to be able to be self-reliant to an extent. Nations around the world are interdependent, but have a measure of self-determination.
Right.
And we see where, even in the case of what you just shared, in the artistic scene, where that was a hamper.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the argument was, and I think there was some legitimacy to it, like in the sense that like the work that we were sending out at the time, the artists that we were sending out was not sort of like meeting where the rest of the region was at that point. I think if you would look at sort of the traditional St. Martin artist, is very rooted in a sort of impressionistic and expressionistic painting style, which is, pre-modern art almost, kind of like a modern art kind of moment. And so, whereas the work that you were seeing promoted in these sort of international art venues was more leaning towards a more contemporary, I like to say post-1950s aesthetic and approach to art making. And so we would always get left out of the discussion because Curacao and Aruba, those artists were able to train in the Netherlands, so they were exposed to sort of like this European market. They saw other modes of creation and thinking, so then that way it sort of
expanded there.
They were making work that sort of met those criteria, not so much us.
Understood. Just for clarity's sake, you say that is Harold Jack, as in the same where Harold Jack location is. Okay, just want.
That's my dad.
Okay, that's
That
awesome. Because there's certain places on St. Martin, like there's a name to the place, but you wonder like who is that person exactly?
Okay.
Yeah. So
Harold Jack.
okay, interesting. Good to know.
Yeah, it's the spot was on the property of my mom's family, Artist Jack Bell, the Bell family property. So that's my people.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool, good people. No problem. So one of the things I saw in your biography online and on a few other websites, it specifically mentions that your work deals with rememory, along with some other stuff, but particularly with rememory. What does it mean, and how did you reach to that concept?
So the notion of rememory, for me, first came about in the writings of Toni Morrison. So as a concept, Toni Morrison wrote about rememory in an essay called The Site of Memory. Creatively, she put it in the book, her novel Beloved. And so if you saw the movie Beloved, you read the book, the idea of rememory is this sort of unrecognized, unresolved memory. It can be traumatic, that's happened to a person or to people that hasn't had an outlet. Like, it's so terrible that it can't be handled in that moment. So it comes back later at a time when it can be dealt with. So if you think about the novel Beloved, there's a moment when Sethi, she's escaped her slave owners and is where she thinks she's free with her kids, and then sees that they've found her. And then she proceeds to kill her kids, right? Because as opposed to letting them go back to slavery. And when they find her, she had started with the baby. And so the baby dies. much later on, like they're so horrified, they sort of like leave her, right? And so she lives in this village, in this small village, and raises her kids. And this young woman shows up, and this young woman is the age that her daughter, that baby, would have been, right? And so basically, this young woman is a haunting. Is this unresolved baby, right? This unresolved memory. So rememory sort of. Is, and the easiest way to explain it is that kind of unresolved memory. So for me, in my work, I was interested in this idea that there were these historical traumas and sort of stories that needed to be told that maybe couldn't be told in those moments, because of just how heavy the trauma was or how close people were still to it, and that it needed years to pass in a way. For us to be able to process it. And so Morrison writes about memory as this kind of an energy that just flows through time and space, waiting for the right person and the right moment to remember, right? And so, and she uses in that essay water as a metaphor, the idea that like when the Mississippi floods its banks, it's not that the river is flooding, it's remembering where it used to be, right? Because usually, throughout years, men have built on riverfronts, redirected water and stuff. And so that when flooding happens, it's not that there's a flood, it's just that the water is remembering where it needs to be. And so those two sort of like concepts and in Toni Morrison's writing as an essayist and as a creative person, I think were foundational in some of the work that I do.
Okay, understood. Now, I'm glad you shared that because another thing that came to mind, as I was looking you up, basically, was in what ways does information determine what artwork you produce and through which medium or format? So, what about, for example, rememory, transcultural existence, or even colonialism moves you to, create a piece of work, but then choosing a format to bring it to life, basically.
Okay. It's tricky, right? Because I don't know if it's tricky. Like because I write poetry as well, and I make visual work. A lot of times people go like, "Well, what makes you, write a poem as opposed to making an art piece?" And a lot of times I say like the work does, when whatever it is I want to say wants to be a poem, it comes out that way. I think of my visual work as a form of visual poetry. I think about the poetics of it all the time. So it's a mix, like I said, like I'm a curious person. So, first of all, in terms of delving into St. Martin and St. Martin's history, when I first started making work that led me to the whole idea of memory, etc., it was because I was in graduate school, being exposed to the work of a lot of international artists and seeing that they were telling the stories of their culture, even if it was through a personal experience, right? And so made me become even more curious and about like, why couldn't we tell St. Martin stories? Like, why couldn't St. Martin be the center of a narrative or a conceptual space in and of itself? And that history was in essence a story that was written by, I don't necessarily say the victor, but the larger sort of, power, the entity in power at the time, right? And so the counter to then a very academic approach, right, and research and all those sort of methodologies that are used to create an archive that excludes us, because our history is more rooted in an oral tradition.
Yes,
and so I'd read essays by like Trinh T. Minh, who had written about her grandmother's story and that idea that those oral traditions are an archive in and of themselves, right? That is, like we say, when an old person passes, an elder passes, we lose a museum. We've lost an archive.
That's right.
And so I was interested then in like creating visuals for an archive that I knew existed in St. Martin, in this sort of space. And that's what led me to initially, looking into that. But then also, as you work, I always think of it like if you were making like a word map, you would have a word in the middle and then you start to think like by association, what are the things that come with it, right? And so you can't, in a way, tell the story of St. Martin without dealing with the idea that we're a Dutch colony, But what does that mean? And what does it mean to be a colony, right? America was a colony, right? So it's not something that your size alone determines, right? Australia was a colony. That's a huge landmass. And so, you want to unpack all those things. You want to look at them and think of them from different perspectives. And so for me, I focused on memory, on nature, thinking about hurricanes as a form of seasonal memory. And what that meant for the island, that we were always being hit by hurricanes, or that they were a part of the natural sort of flow of the region. And so the more you read and the more you sort of dig into things, more information comes. And then some things feed into the work and other things not so much, So, where I'm at now is not where I began. Like where I began, I was really thinking about cultural memory and constructing narratives. And my first set of, not first, but an early work was dealing with this idea of blood memories. And so there were all these red photos. That was back in 2000. And so, like there's a large kind of umbrella idea that I have. And then from that, there are all these sort of sub-stories and narratives that I pull out of things.
Okay, that's beautiful, by the way, because it really leads into my next question, which basically is with noticing, that you have a strong connection with the past, referencing culture, traditions, and history in general. So how important is it to you that the idea and information you use to create is also received and understood by the consumer?
Well, I always hope it's understood by the consumer. One of the things, when you're like in graduate school and you're reading a lot of art theory and concepts that are centered, a lot of it is white philosophers. You have like Hegel and Heidegger and all these Lacan and different names that are Eurocentric, and especially somebody like Hegel, who is like, almost foundational to racist thought, but still gets taught at universities. You have to think about, how do I parse all this information? And so my school that I went to was a really conceptual university, and a lot of times people would make work that's so dense, right? That is so like, almost so abstract that it like almost if you didn't have an art degree, you couldn't look at it and come up with an idea of what it is they wanted to say, right? I've always, in the back of my mind, I think even in graduate school, when I would see people making work like that, I would always say like, somebody in St. Martin needs to be able to understand something, and because I work abstractly as well, that doesn't mean it has to be dumbed down, but I think people had to have something that they could connect to, that makes them want to know more about it. And so in most of my work, there are layers of being able to read it. If you almost like if you were to think of like a Disney movie, right? A lot of times the parents watch the same movie and the kids laugh at some jokes and the parents get the other jokes that are meant for the parents, right? So we want to watch the movie too. So it's the same thing. There are layers that are built of meaning.
Gotcha.
And ways of reading the work. So it is important for me that people see themselves in it. Whether it's the flamboyant trees or the landscape or the sea. I think for me, those are points of entry, right? Because then I can have a conversation then about larger ideas, right? And if you want to think about the archipelago and that kind of thinking, and Glissant and thinking about the abyss, where he associates that with the Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea, but you don't necessarily want to start there. You could start with like, this is an image of, KB Beach. Yeah. And the surface of that. And like, why am I using KB Beach and the water in St. Martin as a metaphor for a larger conversation around, those types of ideas of extraction capitalism and a global climate change and sea level rise and, and things like that.
Understood. So, as you shared earlier as well, you obtained your master's in fine arts some time back. And what I'm curious about is, how has the world of art transformed in your view? And what are some of the main similarities that still exist from, the era or period when you were studying to today's present generation?
Well, I mean, you'd almost have to like say, well, do you mean here in St. Martin, the region, or like globally?
Okay, gotcha. Well, I'll say globally.
Yeah,
because especially with the world being so much more interconnected.
Yes, I mean, because I will say, in some ways, it is. Right now the Caribbean is hot, right? As a in terms of artists who are doing really great things, art collectives that are coming out of Trinidad, and artists that are in the Bahamas and Jamaica, all making huge inroads all over the world right now. The Tate Museum in London, for instance, just had a major museum exhibition of Caribbean artists and artists from the English-speaking Caribbean. And that's like one of the largest museums in England doing that. So I've seen sort of, whether through art history, which I also studied, the idea that art is very Eurocentric, white and male, move towards a much more sort of global perspective. You see, more and more women artists being recognized. It's not that they weren't there; they were always there. But you see, them being way more active as curators. There's a lot of Caribbean curators that are also working in major museums, and therefore they're helping to give voice to artists more and more from the region. And I think it's important then that St. Martin, in a way, be ready, right? Which we are. I think we have like an amazing group of young artists actually that
Definitely.
are doing really, really well abroad. And that's really gratifying to see, because there was a lot of times when I'd be like the only artist from St. Martin, and I'd have to explain what St. Martin was, where we were, and you don't have that as much. I'll also say that conceptually it's been really gratifying to see over the years, when you go to conferences and symposiums and stuff that they do around these exhibitions, that a lot of the philosophy and the underlying like conceptual framework for a lot of art that's being made is actually coming from the Caribbean. They're looking at, Derek Walcott's writings. They're looking at, he's from St. Lucia, for those who don't know, Glissant, Edouard Glissant from Guadeloupe and Martinique. Yeah. And you have Kamal Brathwaite. A lot of people are now citing them, and you hear their names come up way more often in people's papers as they write about the philosophies and the concepts that are underlying Caribbean art, or just global art, actually. So that's very gratifying to see, as well as just sort of, because of the access to materials now, I think it's become more and more possible for artists from especially the smaller sort of Caribbean islands with less resources are now able to access a lot of the same resources that people coming from larger countries can now as well. One of the great things about the pandemic, because there were a couple of things that shifted, especially for the art world, is that so many talks and symposiums and even online exhibitions that, you might not have had access to before are now online or were online. So you could be in St. Martin and see a show that was happening, in Hong Kong. You could attend a lecture that was happening in Hong Kong, where before, if you couldn't afford to fly there, you couldn't participate, You saw that, I want to say it's Tilting Access, which is a organization of curators and museums and gallery owners from the region, who've come together to create opportunities yearly. They had a call for work, and they also were able to include, for the first time I saw like 4 St. Martin artists, 3 St. Martin artists and 1 St. Martin adjacent. She's from Sava. She's in Sava, but, get a residency and participate in this event. But a lot of it, too, has to do with, like, the foundations, right? So you think of when Tilting Access was going on, these are curators and people who have residencies in Barbados, the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, as well as Miami, which we all consider to sort of be...
extension of the Caribbean.
Yeah, extension of the Caribbean. The Perez Museum, which is a big art space with lots of resources and funding, they also participate, which is participated, which was major. And for a long time, St. Martin wasn't invited to Tilting Access because we don't have an art space. We don't have a dedicated museum or like sort of like a gallery that shows St. Martin artists. And so I knew the organizers of Tilting Access, two of them, and I reached out and I would always argue, I was like, look, St. Martin, we don't have it, but we have the artists. You have to let us. So we have the John Lamini Center, and I would like talk about the John Lamini Center as if it was, which it is, right? It's this like very creative space.
Yeah, and the cultural
but
center
it just
too.
doesn't show necessarily visual art. And I kept saying like, how will we ever get to that if we can't get a seat at this table to help make this argument? And so they were like, okay, you can get somebody here. And they did it one year in the Dominican Republic, and I knew it was close enough for someone from St. Martin to be able to go. And so Clara Reyes actually attended that, and and was able. I think once you have a seat at certain tables, right, then you become a juror. And so she was a juror for then the grants, right? And so if you have someone from St. Martin, you're going to have someone who looks at St. Martin artists and explain the work and lobby for them the way that other countries have people on panels that lobby for them.
Indeed.
And so that year we had 4 St. Martin artists win awards, win residencies and grants, right? And so that was really gratifying to see. But a lot of times, we have people who make art, but there are also people who are in charge of the structures of organizations that also contribute, right, that make it possible for artists. And it's important to have people in those spaces as well, like curators and choreographers and people who think about, who are producers in a different way.
Okay, got it. So thank you so much for responding to that question. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll dive in a bit more into that as well. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the News Behind the News with Ralph Kintav on Mix 94.7 FM. And thank you for staying with us on today's program. This afternoon, I'm joining here with Miss Deborah Jack, and really appreciate your in-depth response, really, regarding the I would say the differences but similarities as it regards to art, the creation of art, and even touching base on where possibilities for St. Martin artists and St. Martin to really showcase the breadth and depth of the art that is created here. Because I'd like to ask a follow-up question, based on your experience, network, observation, and everything. What resources do you think St. Martin is most in need of to better support our artists? Because we have talent, we have many gifted people, but sometimes persons get stuck or demotivated and don't get to maximize their potential. So how can we better cultivate their skills, and truly support our artists besides just saying St. Martin has talent?
Well, I think it's that's a great question, right? Because if for most artists, the thing that we need the most is money. I'll just say that, right? There's we need resources to be able to make the kind of work that we need to make. I've always been a little bit wary of like having it be too comfortable, but there's support for artists in a lot of larger countries, more and more. Even in the Dominican Republic, all of these islands have gone about looking for financial resources that support the arts consistently, right? And so I think here we tend to lean a lot on government. I think too much. That's why I left. I wasn't interested in that, like asking all the time. And so I think we have to look at some of the other social players that are here. In the U.S., you have like companies that fund art residencies, or they fund, the people who will then fund the arts as businesses. I think a lot of times businesses here wait for the government as well. And I think you could create a grant for artists to be able to work, but also to travel. I think one of the biggest things, the biggest pluses for me has been that I've been able to travel and see spaces, other work, other artists, I think funding participation in residencies. There are places that you can go that give you 2-3 weeks to just work on your art. They give you a studio space, you have access to resources. But a lot of times, even if you get the residency, you have to travel to that place, and not all residencies fund the travel, for instance, and accommodation. So if we had like something like that would support an artist that said that they qualified for it on their own, they got in, but now what they need is to be able to go there. Or if there's a symposium or something that's happening in the region or even further abroad that you can participate, because the thing about the art world is that you have to be there, you have to show up.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things where, you know, curators have a short attention span because there's so many artists coming. So in a way, you have to be able to have your work in front of them, and you have to be there so you can advocate for your work as much as possible, or at least have somebody do so. And so a lot of times we see these things as kind of like, oh, is this a trip? You want to go somewhere and it looks like fun. But it's actually like lobbying, and it's a way of networking. It's networking the same way you would do in any kind of a business. So I think that's a big part of support. I know that there are more scholarships available now, that we have these talent awards that students are able to get, which, you know, always envious of. But also applying or even bringing people here. I think, you know, there are resources within the region of people who are qualified to come here and give workshops to artists. Creating an artist exchange, what a lot of communities do that don't necessarily have big art infrastructure or facilities, what they'll do is they'll create a residency for someone internationally to come. You give them a space to work, and as part of the requirement of them being, you know, given this trip and coming to St. Martin and working, is that they have to do either like a workshop, or, you know, for the public, or, you know, open studios that people come and see their process and how they work about it. And that's how you educate your community as well, in a way that you don't have to send 10 people away. You can bring one person in, you know, and there are a lot of artists out there who want that, you know, who apply for residencies like that, and then they know that they have to give back in the form of a lecture or a talk. And I think exposure does a lot, you know. Definitely. Until you see it, you don't necessarily know it. And
the network you create as well.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you know, a big aha moment for me was in the Jubilee Library when I was very much younger. Before I went to school, actually, they, you know, all the art books were European books. You had paintings with Van Gogh and all these big art history tomes. And then one day they got a big book that was a history of Latin American. It was Latin American artists, and that was the first time I saw, like, you know, Diego Rivera and Tamayo, like these Mexican masters and people from Latin America, who I still look at today, and the region that was Spanish speaking were all in that book. And it was the first time I saw people making abstraction that were from places that were tropical, like my place, which, because I always assumed that was something that was very European or American. And the thing is that I tell students, even, you know, a lot of Black and brown students, like they assume that abstraction is not their wheelhouse. And the thing is, like, it is, you know, like Wilfredo Lam, who's a Cuban painter back like in early 1900s. He was the first Caribbean artist to be shown in the Museum of Modern Art. He was Picasso's assistant for a while. And when Picasso went to visit Gauguin in Martinique, he took a side trip to visit his grandmother back in Cuba. And up until that time, like, you know, you had Picasso making, like, using Europe, African type of line making in his work and influences. Yeah, and he said he wasn't until he went back and he talked to his grandmother and was just looking at Cuba again, he realized, oh, abstraction is totally ours, right? All the spiritual conversations that he was having with his grandmother. Like, of course we believe in abstraction, you know, like, of course we believe in things that we don't see. And that things can be metaphors, like, right? Dreams have meanings and everything has a symbol. Yeah. So we're already living those things. We weren't necessarily applying them to the art, right? And so, and we can. And you know, and that's a lot of, you know, what my work deals with too. It's like this idea of, like, you can imagine this space, right? You can create a story that's rooted in some parts history, but some part, like, you get to make your own world when you're an artist, and that's the the great thing about it.
Okay, I got you. Now, one of the most important things, where art and artists are concerned is, sometimes artists are taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is because some are not aware of the protections made available to them, but also the need to, for example, copyright, and just fully ensure that, what you create is yours and is not exploited.
Right.
So, what can you share, for any artists listening or would end up listening afterwards or viewing this interview on YouTube, as far as steps and actual things they can do to ensure that, that they are protected, that they are that truly able to reap the financial benefits and other benefits for what they produced, and, that exploitation is not further purported on them.
That's always a tricky space, right? That conversation, because there's so many layers, and almost each art form has its own sort of systems, right? And I know within the Dutch system, it's slightly different than the U.S. one. I think the most important thing is for artists to educate themselves. At this point, there's so many resources that are out there. My primary field is photography and video. So I always tell students, if you're working with images, metadata is your friend. Right? If you don't know what metadata is, you might be already losing the battle. If you work and you have any kind of digital image, because metadata is sort of like because your images and your sound and everything is made up of zeros and ones, you can actually put in your copyright information within the file, right? And it's embedded in the file. And so if somebody takes that image, it's part of the metadata, and they can go in and look and see that this is your image. So when someone steals it, you can prove that they've stolen it. A lot of times people don't put metadata, and that's actually then considered an orphan image. It's an image without a parent. And so one day you could see your image on the cover of a book, because there are people who look for those things. They'll say, well, I went into metadata and there's no way to contact this person. And so all my images have metadata in them after a certain age, but I'm actually redoing all of them. But it's like you put in contact information, because then that becomes something that you could defend in court. I know everybody always talks about with musicians, like owning your masters, which you definitely want to do. One of the things I do notice, a lot of artists like to make prints, because here I think there's a kind of commerce as well, right? Because you want to be able to survive on your work.
Yeah.
So you have to understand the difference between pricing an original work of art and then making copies of that, right? And then there are prints, right? There are prints that you do that are limited edition. Those have more value, as opposed to if you just whip out a bunch of posters, right?
Yeah, I got you.
A lot of people, because of digitization, it becomes really easy to say, oh, I can make you a print, right? If the print isn't signed and numbered, and if it's not registered like somewhere that's like, this is, I'm making only 50 of this, right? Every photo that I have as a print has 5. There is an edition of 5. And 2 artist proofs. And so when somebody buys that, I can charge them, because I say, well, there are only going to be 5 prints of this, and then 2 that are artist proofs. So maximum 7 of these images exist. For me, for video, it's 3, right? And then that is what helps to assign a certain amount of value when you're pricing the work. I think people here have to be careful of being able to just make prints, knowing the quality of the print. But yeah, for doing that, you do the metadata. Back in the day, we used to do when you were writing was that you would write it. If you wrote something, you would mail it to yourself, and then seal the envelope, and then mail it, and then keep it closed when you get it back, right? Mail it to yourself, but don't open it, so that you could prove, because there's a stamp on it from a federal kind of like entity like the post office, that gives you a timestamp for your work. But especially digital work, if you do any kind of digital animation, whatever, then you want to definitely put it in the metadata and put your copyright information there with your name and contact information.
Perfect. Okay. Appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's very useful information. So another question I have is for persons who are doubting whether they can make a living as an artist, and especially for parents who sometimes, discourage their children from considering art as a livelihood due to fears and so forth. What steps can you share for those persons to realize that art goes beyond, being a hobby or even a privilege, but something that one can have as their livelihood?
Right. Art is a field just like almost anything else, right? I think you might grow up wanting to be a brain surgeon, but you don't actually become a brain surgeon. Yeah. I think of art on that level, right? I think there are lots of people who are creative. There are people who are, and then there are people who end up being sort of like fine artists, for lack of a better word, right? And if you want to become someone that makes a living from it, there's so many different points of entry. So I always tell students of mine, I say, well, if you want to make money as an artist, draw horses, paint horses, or take photos of horses, right? And wolves. People buy that. People will buy it. You'll never have to you could just sell them at fairs, and you can make a living painting sort of like beautiful things that you make multiple prints of. Mm-hmm. Knowing what part of the art world you want to access is important.
Yeah.
And so if you say that you want to be an artist on the scale of making work for museums and galleries and that type of thing, well, that's a different tier, right? And that's a tier where even if you don't get a master's degree, you have to be educated and you have to educate yourself, right? So you don't necessarily have to go to college to do that, but you do have to be able to talk about your art, formulate an idea about your art, convince people that what you're saying is important and timely, and that they would want to put money behind it. There are artists who make a living only getting grants. You can write and get, $10,000, $12,000 for you to make your work and for someone to give you so that you can just continue to create. Those are rare grants. Those are hard. And so super competitive. And so you have to be able to do that. I think art is a totally viable career. I'm doing it. I found a way. I think you can become a teacher. I think one of the most important things is to find a job that doesn't drain you. A lot of times, I always say art is kind of like a vow of poverty to a certain extent, but you need a certain kind of mental space to be able to create work, right? And so if you're the scheduler, if you're the manager, if you got to take your work home with you, it becomes hard to make that kind of space to create, right?
Yeah.
So I always tell them, especially when they're younger, so don't try and be in charge of anything. You just want to be able to make enough money so that you can survive and get your materials and then make your art and then get to the next level. But there are people who teach, for me, teaching allows me to have 3 months of the year somewhat open. No other job will do that for me.
And so
if you're in academia, a lot of universities will pay the faculty to make art. Your art is your research, it's your scholarship. So the same way if you're a scientist and you're, studying, the life of bees, then you could also say, well, this artwork that I'm making, about the history of, and culture and mythology on St. Martin is a solid project, and you can write that. Then you too would get funding to make your work. So there's a level of art where your art is scholarship, and it is like as somebody who's writing like a novel. And then there's other levels where, like I said, you can make work that's a good quality and then put it out there. At this point, like you were saying, the world is so small. So you can be a person who has like an Instagram shop and sell things. If you discover like you're a creative person, that you're making something that people are interested in and want to buy, that you can survive on that, right? You can thrive, because you don't want to just survive.
Yes, correct.
But it is also, I think, important for artists and the community to understand that art is valuable and should be valued. The hardest thing that I had here, even when I was here before, is like to try and get people to pay you for your work, right? Art is something that looks like fun. Yeah. Everybody thinks they can do it.
That's right.
Everybody these days have a camera, and everybody can whip up whatever they want on it. So they figure like, why I have to pay you, right? But then when you see what they do and you see what somebody who's trained for it does, is different. So when someone charges you for their art, they're not charging you for the like time that they're making it. No, they're charging you for all the training that they've done to make themselves good at what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's in part what
that
you're
made
paying
you approach
for.
them in the first place.
Right, exactly, right. And so I always get offended, when people do it. And I always say to young artists, even if you want to donate, because everybody always like to ask for, but give me this now, like if you could give me one of these things. And I always say, write an invoice and say what you would charge for it, right? And then put that it's an in-kind donation. But let people see that I am giving you something that's worth $1,000. What you ask me for, I'll do it for free, but it's worth $1,000, right? Which then creates an understanding that you're not just doing them a favor, right? And for you too, as an artist, right? That what you're doing has value. That being said, don't price yourself crazy. Look and see what people in your field make comparably, right? And then price accordingly. A lot of times you see a lot of young artists out the gate want to charge like, $5,000 for a painting. And that's like great if one person buys it and that's all you sell for like 5 years. That 5,000 suddenly doesn't seem like a lot.
Yeah.
Build. Prove that people will pay like 500 for it, and then
that makes sense.
And then 1,000, and then every time you get a new accomplishment, you increase your price based on what you've been accomplishing and the fact that people are willing to buy it. But definitely, write down on a piece of paper, or even if it's a letter saying, okay, I'm willing to donate this service to you, but this is what I would really charge. And then, and maybe for you, especially if you're a business, you can write it off. I don't know how the taxes work here in terms of donations, but at least you can say, well, I've donated $10,000 worth of work, because exposure is not currency.
I was just gonna say that.
That's offensive. You get some exposure, no, that's okay. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah. Like, you wouldn't ask a dentist to, fix your teeth for free if they were your cousin. You wouldn't ask them to do surgery for free. There's things that they have materials, they have resources, they have to pay for the space. Right. It's the same thing for the artist, like we can't assume that it's just the brush and the canvas,
For sure. I appreciate that.
I'm going to stop myself because I can get very...
I see you building up, so it's all good.
Yeah, no, I just, it's a kind of like, it's a form of exploitation.
It is,
and I think people mean well. Some people mean well. But that same thing, if you're a young artist and you're making work, like I said, what you do looks like fun to other people, and you have to set boundaries for yourself, and tell people, look, this is work. I'm working right now. It looked like a painting and a drawing, or working on this comic book, but I'm working, like, call me in an hour, or don't disturb me between this time and this time, and then hold to it, right? Because then people will be like, yeah, no, you have to educate the people around you to let them know that what you're doing is important and it's not play. For sure. So it's, it's a little bit of that too. For sure. Well, there's so many more questions I have for you, but because of time, I have to end it there. But that's okay. I do look forward to having you back here again on the program. Any final words you'd like to share? For who? That's our final words. Oh no, just thank you for having me here. It's exciting. I'm actually giving a workshop at Art Saves Lives that Nicole DeWeaver organizes. Oh, fantastic. So on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, we have professional development for artists workshop. That's perfect. All right. So to our listeners and viewers, that was Ms. Deborah Jack. Be sure to check out online as well and support her work, along with all the amazing artists that we have here on and from St. Martin. Thank you so much for tuning in, and be sure to join us again tomorrow. Take care.